Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. Somebody asked me a question in the week that I thought was quite interesting, so I thought I would base this video around the question in order to be able to answer his question and also provide some, what I hope to be useful information about the treatment of anxiety using natural supplements or natural foods. The question was really, it was after my opinion on a supplement that had the potential to be marketed, and this supplement was clearly aimed as some kind of supplement to cause a calmative effect, to induce sleep. It had a number of products in it that were clearly aimed at inducing sleep or causing a relaxing effect. The main two components of this supplement were L-theanine and tryptophan, and these two components are interesting because they've both been shown to cause to have an anti-anxiety effect in humans. Now, this video is going to be quite complex, and I apologize for that. There's a lot of biochemistry in it, but I just wanted to go into some of the detail about how these two compounds can be beneficial at treating anxiety. And I think this is quite important because a lot of people do suffer from anxiety, and a lot of people who don't admit it are quite anxious. And I think this, particularly around the world at the moment, is a product of the instability that we see around us in the world. And more people are becoming depressed and anxious, and using natural means to treat anxiety and depression, I think, they're often overlooked, and they can be quite simple and very effective. So this will really be looking at the effects of L-theanine and tryptophan on anxiety, and I will talk also about sleep as well. Now this is not intended for any kind of medical advice. This is purely a theoretical discussion about the research that's been performed to date, and I will try and base my answers as closely as I can to the research studies that are available in the scientific literature. And I will try to reduce the speculation and the tentative analysis to keep that to a minimum. If we have a look at these two supplements, or we could call them supplements, they're also available in food. Tryptophan, of course, is an essential amino acid. It's very worthwhile pointing that out. There are many people, there's a lot of information on the internet saying that tryptophan is dangerous. That is simple to refute simply from the fact that it's an essential amino acid. If you don't have tryptophan in your diet, you will die. It's essential to human health, and a diet absent of tryptophan will cause you to die. So it's an essential element. It's one of the essential amino acids. Theanine, L-theanine, is another amino acid, and it's not essential. Now, tryptophan is found in most foods. It's found in starches, it's found in meat as well. There's about a gram of tryptophan in about half a kilogram of meat. So that gives you some kind of reference as to the amount that you could get in your diet. And obviously some foods contain more tryptophan than others, and you can eat a high tryptophan diet. You can pick foods that have high amounts of tryptophan in them, and you can increase the dietary intake of tryptophan that way. L-theanine is an amino acid that's found almost exclusively in tea leaves. That's the leaves of the Camellia sinensis plant. It is found in some small number of other natural products. I think there's some mushrooms that contain L-theanine as well. But in terms of the human diet, we get almost all of our L-theanine from tea. So if you don't drink tea and you're not taking L-theanine supplements, you will have very, very minimal amounts of L-theanine in your diet. Now, both of these, L-theanine and L-tryptophan, have both been researched for their anti-anxiety effects, and both appear to be effective anti-anxiety treatments. That doesn't mean that they will work all of the time. Many of these natural products will work with some people, and it really depends what's causing your anxiety, and it's very important to be able to understand how they may cause these anti-anxiety effects. But I've said this many times before in many of my other videos: if you are stressed or if you are suffering from anxiety, the best and primary way to get over that is to first of all find out what is causing the stress and what is causing the anxiety and remove it from your life. Trying to fight the stress or the anxiety or the depression by providing by changing your diet is a good strategy, but it will ultimately fail unless you can remove the thing in your life that is causing those problems. It's often overlooked by people. People want to take a pill, they want to get rid of depression, they want to get rid of anxiety, they want to get rid of stress. It's really going to be, even your pharmaceutical medication, natural products, they're not going to be effective unless you can get rid of the source of that stress that's maybe causing the depression or the anxiety. And that's a very important strategy. So these nutrients that you can take to help with depression and help with stress, help with anxiety, they do help, and science has shown them to help, but they're not miracle cures. So that's something that also needs to be taken into account. I would also stress as well, that I've said many times before, these supplements that I talk about when I talk about individual amino acids such as L-tryptophan or L-theanine, they are effective if you incorporate them as part of a healthy diet. You cannot expect supplements to work if you're eating a very unhealthy diet. Supplements, nutrition doesn't work that way. Nutrition is a very synergistic thing. You need to have all of the components together like a jigsaw. You can only see the big picture when you put all of those pieces of the jigsaw together. That brings the picture together and gives you your optimal health. You can't expect to take a single pill to have an improvement in your overall health. That's not to say there aren't certain things you can take that do improve your health, but the effect will always be bigger, and it's always magnified if you're eating a healthy diet as well. And quite often, if you start eating a healthy diet, you find that you don't need a lot of these supplements because the problem was actually caused by a poor quality diet to start with. Remember, a poor quality diet will expose you when you're exposed to stress. If you have a poor quality diet, that stress will affect you to a much higher degree than if your diet was a really high quality diet. High quality diets have been shown to give you resistance to stress, particularly certain components within the diet. And this is known from a lot of studies on exercise. Exercise is a form of stress. Those people who have high quality diets have a much higher resistance to the stress from exercise, and they have a much higher tolerance of exercise, and they can increase their training intensity and their training duration. Okay, so let's have a look. Now I've given you those caveats. Let's have a look at these two substances and see how they can be useful in somebody's dietary strategy to help maybe reduce the effects of stress in terms of anxiety. Tryptophan, I'm going to use the term tryptophan and 5-hydroxytryptophan interchangeably. 5-hydroxytryptophan is simply a metabolite really of tryptophan. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid. It's absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. It goes into the plasma, it raises plasma levels of tryptophan, and then it can pass into the brain through the blood-brain barrier. In the blood-brain barrier there is an amino acid transporter called the L-type amino acid transporter. It's also called the large neutral amino acid transporter because it transports the large neutral amino acids. So that includes the branch chain amino acids, that's leucine, isoleucine and valine. It includes L-tyrosine, it also includes tryptophan, and there are a number of other amino acids that can pass through that transporter, but those are the ones that we're really interested in. And incidentally, L-theanine also uses that transporter, and we'll come back to that later. So it gets into the brain through the L-type amino acid transporter, and then in the brain, tryptophan is converted to 5-hydroxytryptophan, and 5-hydroxytryptophan is converted to serotonin, and serotonin is subsequently converted to melatonin. Melatonin is one of the hormones in your brain that is able to induce sleep. Now, if you notice that pathway, the 5-hydroxytryptophan is simply a step closer to producing serotonin. So theoretically, taking 5-hydroxytryptophan should be a more efficient way of raising serotonin levels. But it does appear that both tryptophan and 5-hydroxytryptophan are effective at raising brain levels of serotonin. And that effect, therefore, the effect of increased levels of serotonin in the brain is quite interesting, because low levels of serotonin may be associated with depression, and they may be associated with some other mental disorders as well. However, going the other way, high levels of serotonin can also be can also represent associated with particular mental disorders. Now, the benefit of using natural products such as L-tryptophan or 5-hydroxytryptophan to boost levels of serotonin is that they tend to increase levels of serotonin to what they physiologically normally should be. Using pharmaceutical medications, you can actually increase levels of serotonin above what they normally are, and that's because of the way they work. They tend to decrease degrading enzymes. They tend to inhibit enzymes that cause the excretion of the products of the serotonin, and therefore they boost serotonin in that way. By supplying the raw materials to produce the serotonin, you're giving the brain what it's perhaps missing in order to be able to encourage it to increase levels of serotonin. And the safety record of tryptophan has been reviewed, and tryptophan has a very, very good safety record. There is a lot of information on the internet about tryptophan being dangerous. There was an incident in, I believe it was America, where tryptophan caused a number of, I think maybe even deaths, but it certainly caused illness in a lot of people. And that was nothing to do with the tryptophan. It was an ingredient that was added to the pills that actually caused that effect, and that was due to the manufacturing process. And that is widely known in nutritional circles, and it was nothing to do with tryptophan whatsoever. And we're talking about very low levels of tryptophan here. We're talking about up to maybe a gram, which isn't as much as you can get in food. So we're not talking about huge dietary supplementation with tryptophan. We're talking about providing tryptophan in a measured nutritional amount at a particular time of the day in order to be able to induce sleep or reduce anxiety. So once the tryptophan's in the brain, or the 5-hydroxytryptophan, it's converted to serotonin, and that may have an effect on sleep. Studies have shown that L-tryptophan just before bedtime induces sleep. Now, here's another interesting aspect of the nutritional literature that has to be taken into consideration, and that is that many studies use very high levels of tryptophan in their studies, and so the conclusions that they draw have to be looked at separately from those that have used much lower doses. I'm talking about using maybe up to about a gram of tryptophan, which is usually about 2 tablets that you would get in a pot. I'm maybe talking about 50 to 300 milligrams of 5-hydroxytryptophan, so small amounts that are within the recommended amount by the manufacturers. Many studies have looked at using tryptophan in 10 grams, 15 grams, maybe even more. Now, if we compare the effects from these two types of studies, what we find is that when you take tryptophan before bed in low amounts, what happens is you fall asleep more quickly, but your EEG, your brainwave activity, doesn't appear to change. You do appear to have people report having a better night's sleep. They fall asleep more quickly, and they tend not to wake up so much, so they tend to have a better quality sleep. Now, I would suggest that if you can sleep better and if you can sleep more, that's going to have a very important effect on stress, and that may affect and reduce anxiety. If we look at the studies that have used very high amounts of L-tryptophan, so 10 to 15 grams of L-tryptophan, these studies do tend to affect the EEG recordings, the electrical activity of the brain when the person is asleep. And what tends to happen at those very high concentrations is that the non-REM sleep, the stages 1 to 3, tends to increase, and the REM sleep tends to decrease. The effect of that is not really known, and it's interesting from a biochemical point of view. Firstly, because it appears that is not enacted through a serotonin mechanism. There have been studies that have used inhibitors that prevent the conversion of tryptophan to serotonin, and we still see this effect. And therefore, what we can conclude from this is that this change in the EEG recording, the electrical activity of the brain, is not really an effect of serotonin. It's tryptophan having another effect in the brain. So it's very important, if you look in the literature, to understand that you've got to look at the dose that's being used. These studies are very different. Very lower doses that you could get in food and higher doses that are more of a pharmacological administration have very different effects. And really, I'm not talking about those high dosage. They're interesting from a biochemical point of view. Many of those studies have been done on animals, but there have been some human studies done as well. I'm more interested in the lower amounts of tryptophan that are really realistic of what a normal person would take who was taking L-tryptophan or maybe 5-hydroxytryptophan. So what I think you can get from taking 5-hydroxytryptophan or tryptophan before bedtime is a better night's sleep. You fall asleep more quickly, you tend to wake up less, and there is some evidence that you may increase delta wave sleep, but like I say, many of these studies have found no changes in the EEG pattern of the sleep, and therefore that's not really something to take into consideration. So I think a better night's sleep will help reduce stress, which may in turn help reduce anxiety. If we look at those people that have low levels of serotonin, we do see there is an association between low levels of serotonin and depression, but we're not sure if it's a cause or effect. We're not really sure how from the literature, it's not really possible to show how this works. And certainly when you start messing about with serotonin levels with drugs, you do seem to get you may improve one aspect but actually decrease health in another aspect, and this is why drugs like Prozac are associated with an increased rate of suicide in young people that take those drugs. So I think as long as the dosages are kept within those that you can find in food, and as long as they're kept at a realistic amount, there is the tryptophan, the safety record of tryptophan and 5-hydroxytryptophan is very good, and I think that there are benefits there to anxiety. How would you? Some people say, how would you take L-tryptophan? When would you take it? Because you're perhaps using it to induce sleep, and it certainly does seem to induce sleep. And if you take it during the day, it does again seem to induce sleep. So that's why I say it should be taken towards the end of the day in the evening. The way that tryptophan is most effectively pushed into the brain is by removing the competition from the other amino acids that are also trying to get into the brain. So that's the branched chain amino acids and L-tyrosine. Now the branched chain amino acids can be removed from circulation quite effectively by taking some carbohydrate. The carbohydrate will stimulate the release of insulin, and insulin will push the branched chain amino acids into skeletal muscle and also adipocytes as well, but it will take it out of the plasma. That increases the relative amount of tryptophan that is in the plasma, in the blood, and that means that more of the tryptophan can then get into the brain. So taking tryptophan with carbohydrates appears to be an effective way of getting it into the brain, and that should increase serotonin levels more. So really, if you're looking at taking perhaps L-tryptophan or 5-hydroxytryptophan in the evening, take it with a small amount of carbohydrate, which could contain glucose. So that would be starch or glucose. So starch might be a bowl of cereal, it could be a small amount of rice, it could be a piece of bread, or a piece of fruit that contains glucose, such as grapes or a banana, or perhaps some fruit juice, a small glass of fruit juice, to release some insulin, and that will then push the tryptophan into the brain, because it will take away some of this competition. And obviously if you do that in the evening, that is hopefully then going to induce sleep, and an improved night's sleep should help to a certain extent with stress. If we look at L-theanine, L-theanine is another substance. Like I say, it's found in tea. It appears to be very well absorbed from the small intestine. It possibly absorbed on the methionine transporter in the small intestine, and it passes into the plasma very quickly. From the plasma, it again uses the L-type amino acid transporter, and that would suggest that it does actually compete with some of these other large neutral amino acids to get into the brain. But studies that have been done on rats and other animals have shown that if L-theanine is administered, the L-theanine does get very quickly into the brain, because these rats are sacrificed and their brain tissue is analysed, and the L-theanine is found there. So we know that it gets into the brain. Now, when L-theanine gets into the brain, it appears to have an effect on the alpha wave state of the brain. There are a number of different brain waves. Beta waves tend to be associated with excitation when you're awake. So if you're in an excited state when you're awake, you're in your beta wave state. Alpha waves are in another awake state, but they are in a relaxed state. If you're in a very focused, very relaxed, very calm state when you're awake, you're generally in your alpha wave state, and that is what that's the wave state that L-theanine appears to be able to generate and increase. Your other waves, like your delta waves and your theta waves, are to do with sleep. So we're interested in the alpha waves that are a part of your wake cycle. And that's really where theanine seems to be effective. And this probably explains the calming effect of a cup of tea. Many people who drink tea say it has a calming effect. I agree with that. Unlike coffee, which is a very drink that causes a lot of excitation, you can feel the adrenaline when you've had a cup of coffee. Tea doesn't seem to be the same. And there is some evidence from animal studies that the L-theanine actually antagonises caffeine. So it has a balancing effect on the caffeine, which makes tea a calming drink rather than a coffee, which is a more excitatory drink, and that is possibly because of the L-theanine. So if you like to drink tea or coffee and you switch to drinking more tea, you may find that it has a calming effect on you overall. Now, as I say, the alpha wave state is a very calming, focused state. And increasing alpha waves may be a good way of reducing anxiety because of that calming effect. And I do recommend those people that do find they have anxiety, if you don't drink tea, drinking tea is one of the first things you could try. Theanine is available in supplements, but there is a lot of theanine in tea, and you actually have to take quite a lot of it. You need quite a lot of the dietary supplement to actually match the amount that is in tea. It's obviously in both green tea and black tea, and it's quite high amount. So a number of cups of tea throughout the day actually supplies quite a lot of theanine, which would then increase this alpha wave state. Now, the reason I've mentioned these two chemicals together, they both appear to have this calming effect. One of them is a sleep-inducing calming effect, and the other is perhaps an effect that you would want during the day when you are awake. So they both have a part to play in, and you could take them together in terms of the fact that you could drink tea or take theanine supplements throughout the day, and then you could switch to taking L-tryptophan before bed in order to be able to induce sleep. And that would be a reasonable strategy, and if you wanted to do that naturally, you could drink tea throughout the day to provide the L-theanine, and then you could simply have a carbohydrate snack close to bedtime. That carbohydrate would produce the insulin would push the tryptophan into the brain and then increase serotonin levels, and there would be no need to take any supplements at all then. So what we're really talking about here is these effects can be mimicked through food and through dietary manipulation, which is important to understand. You don't have to go to supplements, and I would always recommend that you try and get these effects from foods first and see if you can actually induce these effects that you want. So you can induce serotonin, increase serotonin levels in the brain by taking carbohydrate food before you go to bed, and this is one of the reasons that carbohydrate food quite often makes people sleepy, because of this insulin releasing effect, which increases brain levels of serotonin and then melatonin. Now, it's interesting that theanine competes with the other large amino acid, neutral amino acids to get into the brain through the L-type amino acid transporter. There have been some studies that have looked at the interaction between L-theanine and tryptophan, and what generally appears to be the case is that when you take L-theanine, you increase brain levels of tryptophan. And that's quite interesting, but at the same time, serotonin levels tend to go down. So this would generally suggest that L-theanine is in some way increasing the excretion or the degradation of serotonin in the brain. And this is it's very difficult to understand why this would be, why this is important, where this fits into, the big picture, because there have been so few studies done and there's so little information on it. But if that is true, the L-theanine decreases levels of serotonin in the brain, this may explain why it's a very calming but very a cup of tea is very calming, but it keeps you awake. Reducing the amount of serotonin in the brain, even just by a small amount, would decrease that sleepiness that you might otherwise have experienced. And we're not talking about great changes, we're talking about very small changes. And I have to emphasize that these studies are done in animals, and therefore they may not be the same effects that you see in humans. But like I say, this is a speculative video that's looking at the theory of this in order to be able to throw some information out there to help you to think about the best strategy that you could have to be able to use these supplements and incorporate them into your own diet. So really, theanine and tryptophan are interesting because if theanine does decrease levels of serotonin and increase brain levels of tryptophan, it would suggest that there's plenty of tryptophan in the brain to be able to be converted into serotonin, but that the theanine is in some way inhibiting that conversion, either through a rapid breakdown of the serotonin and excretion of it, or perhaps it actually it inhibits the conversion of the tryptophan to the serotonin. But either way, they seem to have this, taking them together in the same supplement would seem to have this antagonistic effect, because if you're taking tryptophan, you're trying to increase brain levels of serotonin, but then you take the theanine, and that would then decrease the brain levels of serotonin. So they may actually be antagonistic in their effects. That's not to say that you couldn't use them together, but you'd have to temporarily space them. You'd have to take the theanine during the day, and then when the theanine levels started to drop, you could then take your tryptophan in the evening, and that would then boost your serotonin levels to increase your sleep. And the fact that theanine is really increasing alpha wave state would suggest that it's really a supplement that should be taken during the day in order to be able to benefit from that calm but awake state. And that is perhaps something that would be, theanine would perhaps be better to take with L-tyrosine, which has that waking, that ability to keep you awake. And to remember, tyrosine is also a compound, another amino acid. Although it doesn't induce sleep, it does increase wakefulness, but at the same time it has been shown to be a very effective anti-stress compound. And in fact, brain levels of tyrosine, when you increase them, have been shown to be a very good way to combat stress. And many of the early studies that were done on tyrosine in the brain were done in the military because of the stress that soldiers are under in battlefield conditions. So another amino acid that's worth looking at is L-tyrosine, and I can do another video on that and look at that specifically. But I would suggest that from the scientific, certainly the scientific information I've read, that theanine is something that would be better to be taken during the day, and it would fall more into the camp of L-tyrosine than it would L-tryptophan, which I think is something that could be taken later at night. Now, in this supplement that I was shown in this formula, there was also chamomile, and chamomile would be something that would go together more with tryptophan, because it's something you would take as to have a calming effect, but it also induces sleep. So these compounds can have very different effects, and being able to tell what they're going to do when you take them together is very difficult. It's very difficult to know how they would interact, and this is why I would suggest, if you do want to take any of these compounds, obviously stick to the manufacturer's recommended intakes, but you need to change one thing in your diet at a time in order to be able to see the effect it has. If you take a supplement that has many different things in it, you really don't know what effects those things are having. The other problem that I've mentioned before is if you take formulas that are made by supplement companies, you can't change the ratios. If you take the supplements individually, you can tailor them to your own needs, and you don't have to take them at the ratios that are produced in the tablets. They obviously have the advantage that these formulas generally do work. They have been tested, but often they haven't, and this is the point. Synergism in nutrition is one of the things that is very rarely researched. Much of the nutritional research is done on individual compounds, the same as it is in the pharmaceutical industry. One compound, one effect, one measurement, and that is then reported on. It's only recently that people have started to actually research diets as a whole, to research the interaction of compounds in more detail in terms of everyday nutrition. So I hope that was interesting. The conclusion probably is that we don't really know, and it's something that you would have to look into yourself. And you've got to be careful, because the research really hasn't really got beyond the animal stage at this point in terms of these two compounds and how they could be useful together. But individually, L-tryptophan and 5-hydroxytryptophan certainly appear to have sleep-inducing effects, and at low concentrations, low doses, the amount that you would find in food, they certainly don't seem to have much of an effect on brainwave pattern. L-theanine is certainly been quite widely researched, and I think it's safe to say that it does increase the alpha wave state of the brain, and that would have a calming effect, but it would be a calming effect that would be a wakeful calming effect rather than a sleep-inducing calming effect. So they work in quite different ways, and possibly both are worth trying if you do suffer from anxiety, or you feel like you're under stress, or you feel like you need that calming effect to be able to let you relax at some point. You know, some people find it very difficult to turn off. They're constantly on edge, and those supplements may make the difference. But like I say, you can get L-theanine in tea by drinking tea. You can get very high amounts of L-theanine, and you can increase brain levels of L-tryptophan by taking carbohydrates that release insulin. So I hope that was interesting. If you've got any comments on this video, please leave them in the comments box below, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible, and I will see you soon for another video. And in the meantime, take care.